course, thank you to the Templeton Foundation, to Wake Forest University, and also, of course, to Christian Miller. It's been a pleasure to be part of this project over the past year, so thanks a lot for that. So I'm going to be talking about testimonial justice and the virtue of deference. So in general, I'm interested in the question of us not always deferring to the people we should, and it being a virtue to defer to the people you should, and questions about how to promote that virtue of getting us to defer to the people that we should be deferring to because they know what they're talking about. And specifically, what I wanted to try to convince you of today are 4 things. So first, I'm going to start out by suggesting that there is a consequentialist notion of epistemic virtue, on which epistemic virtues simply are dispositions that promote or conducive to epistemic goods. Then I'm going to suggest that being disposed to defer to reliable sources in testimonial context is an epistemic virtue in this consequentialist sense. Thirdly, I'm going to suggest that one way to instill the virtue of deference is by promoting compliance with the requests on the part of reliable sources to be listened to. And finally, I'm going to suggest that one way to promote compliance with such requests is by having the relevant sources manifest a virtue of their own, namely a virtue related to what I'm going to call testimonial justice. All right, so let's start with the consequentialist notion of virtue that I'm interested in. Again, this is a notion in which virtues simply are dispositions that promote goods. So this is the kind of notion of virtue that we find in someone like John Stuart Mill. So for John Stuart Mill, who is not a virtue ethicist, but has a theory about virtue, and his theory is roughly that virtues are dispositions that promote happiness, and vices are dispositions that promote the opposite of happiness, such as pain. And 2 points about this. So Mill is, of course, extremely aware that a lot of people might take us to value virtues for their own sake and independently of their conduciveness to happiness. He doesn't deny that. What he wants to say about those cases is that what has happened is that we've basically forgotten the original yardstick with reference to which the virtues became virtues, namely this conduciveness, and come to value or disvalue the relevant dispositions in themselves. So what he wants us to do here is roughly make a distinction between something being valued and something being valuable. And he doesn't deny that we might value virtue for its own sake. He would only deny that virtues are valuable for their own sake. Second point is, on this consequentialist notion of virtue, this is compatible with virtue often being accompanied by a certain kind of motivation, maybe a motivation to perform the virtue for its own sake. And also with virtues often being acquired in some particular way, maybe through experience, for example. But for Mill, what's important to note here is that these things aren't necessary for possessing virtue. The only thing that's necessary for possessing virtue is for the relevant disposition to, in Mill's case, promote happiness. Okay, so moving from ethics to epistemology, and specifically to a consequentialist notion of epistemic virtue, I'm going to take it that attaining true belief and avoiding false belief are epistemic goods. And what is reliable, I'm going to understand, as epistemologists typically do, as that which is conducive to avoiding false belief, so reducing the incidence of error, roughly. Now, to defer, when I talk about deferring, I'm going to mean to listen and to believe what is being said because it's being said. So when you're deferring, you're doing 2 things. You're listening and you're believing something because you're listening, okay? And to be disposed to defer to reliable sources in particular is an epistemic virtue, since it has one avoid false belief and as such is conducive to an epistemic good, namely that of reliability. And that, on the relevant consequentialist notion, is all it takes for something to constitute a virtue, an epistemic virtue. Okay, so here's a question. How can we instill the epistemic virtue of deference as just defined? Well, I'm going to suggest that we can do so by promoting a certain form of compliance. And why think about compliance here? Well, here is one way to think about what sources that are telling you stuff are doing. They're providing a request together with a piece of information. So take the following that we might be telling our students in ethics class, for example. Listen, that's a request. all utilitarians are consequentialists, but all consequentialists are not utilitarian. Okay. So you're providing a request and a piece of information as a source, in this case, in an educational setting. And when listening, we're complying with the relevant request, the request to be listened to, coming from the source. Now, compliance in this sense, compliance with these kinds of requests to be listened to, promotes deference given an empirical assumption that I'm going to make, namely that listening is conducive to believing. And of course, this is not fail-safe and is compatible with the occasional failure. So often when we tell people certain things, they don't believe us. But all I need by way of this empirical assumption is that listening at least increases the chances of belief. What I'm interested in here is the extent to which we can increase the incidence of epistemic good in a population at large. So if we have some kind of intervention that does that, whether or not it succeeds in every single case, that's a good thing from the point of view of trying to increase the amount of epistemic good that's out there. Okay, so here's another question. How can we promote the relevant form of compliance for the purpose of instilling virtue? And here is my suggestion, that there seems to be a kind of testimonial justice that, if practiced by reliable sources, will increase not only the extent to which we consult them on the relevant matters, but also the rate of compliance with their requests for us to listen to them, which will be correlated with us believing what they're telling us, assuming, again, that listening is conducive to believing in the relevant sense. That's my suggestion. So more specifically, my hypothesis is this, that sources practicing the relevant kind of justice increase their chances of being perceived as fair, which increases consultation and compliance rates. Okay. So why believe that? Well, here is some empirical support for this hypothesis. So Tom Tyler and colleagues for a while have been studying why people follow the law. And it turns out, of course, in one traditional theory, people follow the law roughly because of fear of sanctions. Turns out, if Tyler is right, that fear of sanction is not the most important and maybe not a particularly important factor behind why people follow the law. A more important factor is people considering the relevant laws or lawgivers as fair and thereby legitimate in the sense of being worthy of deference. Okay. Now, what's interesting for our purposes is that there's nothing unique about following laws here. This seems to apply to rule following more generally. So in further studies, for example, the same reasoning is seen to apply to compliance with policies in corporate as well as non-corporate settings. And furthermore, there's also evidence to believe that perceived fairness has an influence both on whether to consult someone on a relevant issue and whom to consult insofar as you're going to consult someone. So let's say a couple of things about the relevant kind of fairness. So what is it that people perceive? So what does it take for people to perceive someone as being fair? What is the content of the relevant fairness judgments here? Well, it seems that there are four components, the four most important components. The first one being what I'm going to call input. So this is the condition that as someone that is supposed to obey or comply, you are being provided with an opportunity to state your case, whether or not you take this to be such that it will influence the outcome. So it seems, in other words, that people value being able to provide input irrespective of whether they think that that input will have any substantive impact on the outcome of the decision on the part of the people that they are providing input to. So we seem to value stating our case in its own right and independently of whether or not that will change the relevant decision. Second condition is consideration. We not only want it to be the case that there's an opportunity for us to provide input, we want it to be the case that the people we're providing input to, at the very least, are considering that input. Again, whether or not our input is going to be reflected in the outcome. And Tyler's research suggests that it's fairly easy to satisfy this consideration. If you're a source and you're considering input, it's often sufficient to simply explain that the relevant input was considered, but unfortunately could not be reflected in the in the outcome for these and these reasons. Okay. But people at the very least want to know that their input has been considered, whether or not it's been reflected in the outcome. Okay, the third condition, which I'm calling factuality. You don't just want to provide input and have it be considered, you want it to be considered in a particular way, namely in a way that is sensitive only to the facts of the matter, not to any biases or personal preferences on part of the evaluator. Finally, the fourth and final condition is what I'm calling effort. You want to feel that the people you're providing input to in the relevant matter is at the very least trying to be fair. They're not just going through the motions and satisfying these conditions. They are motivated to do the relevant things. They're motivated to try to satisfy these conditions, to sincerely provide a venue for input, consider explaining when it can't be reflected in the output. Okay. So these seems to be the four most important components of the relevant fairness judgments. When we feel that these conditions are satisfied, we perceive the relevant source as fair in the relevant sense. Okay, so to spell it out, my hypothesis is the following. Sources that make an effort to provide us with an opportunity for input and consider that input in a factual manner increase their chances of being perceived as fair, which in turn increases consultation and compliance rates with their requests. So if we were to come up with a slogan, it would be roughly this: people listen to people who listen. Okay? So formulating the slogan in this way, I'm making an assumption about the relation between de facto justice and perceived justice. That assumption being that the best way to seem just is to be just. Okay? So that's the relationship, I take it, between perceived justice and actual justice on the part of sources. All right, so which brings us to the virtue of testimonial justice, as I understand it. So I started out by saying that on a consequentialist notion of intellectual or epistemic virtue, virtues are dispositions that promote goods, and in this case, when we talk about intellectual epistemic goods, specifically, it's epistemic virtue, specifically epistemic goods. Now, listening in a testimonially just manner, I've suggested, in light of the evidence, will increase consultation and compliance rates with the requests on the part of sources to be listened to. Now, increasing these rates, of course, if you're a reliable source, is to, in fact, to promote the reliability of the hearers that you're speaking to. That will be reliable insofar as they defer to you as a reliable source. So as such, it seems that reliable sources being disposed to listen in a testimonially just manner is an epistemic virtue. All right, so to conclude, I suggested that there is a consequentialist notion of epistemic virtue on which virtues are simply dispositions that promote epistemic goods, such as attaining true belief or avoiding false belief. Then I suggested that being disposed to defer to reliable sources in particular is an epistemic virtue in this consequentialist sense. Then I suggest that one way to instill that virtue of deference is by promoting compliance with the requests on the part of reliable sources to be listened to, assuming that what sources are doing is, in effect, providing a request to be listened to together with a piece of information. Finally, I suggested, in the light of work of people like Tom Tyler and colleagues, that one way to promote compliance with such requests is by having the relevant sources manifest a virtue of their own, namely the virtue associated with what I call testimonial justice. All right, thanks so much.
Turn back to John.
Thanks very much for that. That was really clear and impressive. So I had a question. It came up on the slide where you had the four components of testimonial justice. So there was input, consideration, factuality, and effort.
Yeah. Do you want me to pull it up? Or?
Sure, if you want. Probably help people conceptualize the question.
Oh, there we go. This one, yeah.
Are each of these like reflected in the work by Tyler and colleagues?
Yes.
So I have a question about the factuality.
Yeah, good.
So there's actual empirical work done demonstrating.
Good.
I just find it so hard to believe that it promotes deference when people feel like the relevant authority is not considering their personal preferences.
So is that
Is
considered?
not like attentive to or considering their input in light of the people's personal preferences. As the person giving the input.
Oh,
So if I think, well,
Good.
they just don't care what I like
Good.
or feel or anything, my own gut tells me in a case like that, I would be less inclined. That would
Yes.
motivate me to not listen as much to this authority. But if I felt like they were reaching out to me and they felt my pain, like Bill Clinton felt my pain, maybe Bill Clinton's a
person.
bad example. I don't want Bill Clinton feeling it, but it just seems to me like it would work in exactly the opposite
Good.
way.
thanks, John. Yeah, so there is a misunderstanding here. That what this formulation is supposed to do, and this is an unclarity on my part. So what I have in mind when I talk about personal preferences here are personal preferences of the evaluator that are assumed to be irrelevant to the facts of the matter. So I'm not claiming that the evaluation has to be independent of your preferences as the person that I'm listening to. So maybe a better, this is not a very happy formulation, maybe a better word to rest on here is the prejudice part. So the idea is that you shouldn't as an evaluator, your evaluation shouldn't be influenced by personal preferences on your part or prejudices in the worst case that are irrelevant to the facts of the matter that you're supposed to be evaluating. Just something like that. And it might also, something that might follow from factuality is also some form of predictability. It might be if you're strictly, as an evaluator, only considering the facts of the matter, it's going to be the case that like cases are going to be treated alike, which might be another thing that we would value in an evaluator. So does that clear it up? Or? Okay, thanks.
Okay, so this is, I think, just a clarification followed by a possible friendly amendment. So I thought I heard you say that intellectual virtue requires deference to reliable sources, or to those one regards as reliable. If that's part of your view, I'm wondering what you think of the following.
Can I clarify that one and see if that makes a difference?
Sure.
So I'm not suggesting that intellectual virtue requires deference. I'm suggesting that deference to reliable sources would constitute an esteemed virtue. Of course, there might be other ways to be intellectually virtuous than by way of deference.
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you think that whether you're intellectually virtuous on the whole depends not just on whether you're deferring, say, to a reliable source, but also on what other evidence that's relevant that you have to go on.
Right.
So it seems like there are going to be cases where flat-out deference
Yeah.
is vicious if your evidence points in the opposite direction from what the person is
Good. Yeah, good. No, this is an important point to push, and not something I addressed here. So I take it that you're imagining a kind of case where, say, we have an in fact reliable source that is telling me something. The source is in fact reliable, but I, as a hearer, have, say, good evidence to believe the source to be either insincere or incompetent on the relevant matter. So I have reason to believe the source not to be trustworthy. Is that the kind of case you have in mind?
That'd be one kind of case. I don't want to take up
Yeah.
too much time here. The kind of case I really have in mind is where I think someone's reliable. They testify to P.
Yeah.
But I have independent evidence
Yeah.
that not P. It seems like in that sort of case,
Yeah.
I ought not just defer to them. I ought to consult them and take their
Yeah.
testimony into account, but
Yeah.
that's only part of my total
Yeah.
evidence.
Good. Yeah. No, that's an interesting case. So, in general, what I would say about that case, so in a sense, what evidence you have as a hearer is not really relevant to whether or not you're manifesting a virtue here. That's the position I would take. What matters is whether or not you are deferring to an, in fact, reliable source. Now, you're saying, now this is an interesting question about, you might ask, well, in that kind of case, why not simply factor in what the relevant source is telling me here as opposed to deferring? So deferring seems to suggest that I'm just taking your word for it. Now, the problem there, so Joseph Raz has a really interesting discussion about this in relation to political authority. we can imagine this as some kind of epistemic authority analog. And he's talking about how if you're in a situation where you have a source that is in fact more reliable than you, and we can assume also reliable in an absolute sense, unless you simply defer to that person, you will be worse off as compared to if you simply factor in the relevant kind of information. And I think a similar argument can be made in this case, to the effect that you're going to be better off, whether or not you think you're going to be better off, whether or not your evidence suggests you're going to be better off, you're in fact going to be better off by simply deferring insofar as the source is reliable. If you simply try to factor it in, you're going to perform worse than you have to. So I mean, you can tie this to their interesting results. I forget who ran these results, but so they were pitting lab rats against human beings. And because it turns out lab rats work in the following way. If they find that something works most of the time, they will do that all of the time, okay? So if they find something works 70% of the time, they will do that 100% of the time, with the result that they would succeed in 70% of the time. What people try to do is we try to probability match. So if we find that something works in 70% of cases, we're going to try to figure out which case we're in each individual case, and we're going to tend thereby to decrease our reliability, because we're not going to hit 70, which we would if we simply did that all the time. We're going to do worse because we're going to misjudge a lot of the cases and think we're in the 30% as opposed to 70% cases when we're not, and so forth. So I think you can make a similar kind of argument with deference here. Now that was a very long answer. Did that at all clear anything? Okay. Thanks, Nathan. That's helpful.
All right, so here's what we have. We have, where did that? I don't know. Oh, it's Terrence.
Nate asked my question.
Now you asked your question?
Yeah.
Very good.
Not
Okay, so Walter, Ann, then Anita, and then Guy.
So I would like to ask you to apply this to an example, because I'm not sure how it fits. And my paradigm case of deference is like scientists. You know, the scientist says the speed of light's 186,000 miles per second or whatever. And then I go, okay. And but it seems like they're not giving me an opportunity to state my input. They're not considering my input. They have a prejudice, namely they knew it before I ever asked. And so I just don't know how this applies to what I take to be the paradigm case of deference.
Very good. So I think, so this is, what I'm proposing here is a tool for promoting deference. Whether or not that's the only tool, of course, I'm leaving open.
But
And
the
there,
scientist tool works really well because everybody defers to them, and yet they don't.
well, do they?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
I mean, do you really
We're in
know
America.
whether the speed of light's 186,000?
Well, I mean,
Have you ever done the
take
experiment?
evolution and take climate change.
There
I
are
mean, I
few
think
exceptions.
these are, yeah, but important exceptions. And so I think there are certainly some cases wherein people simply defer to competent people. Those are not the cases I'm worrying about. Those are not the cases wherein we have what we might call a problem of deference, namely a case where people are not deferring in the way they should. So those would be, as far as I'm concerned, the less epistemologically interesting cases. The interesting cases are when people are not doing what they should. And there are such cases also in the sciences. So the suggestion here might be, maybe this would provide a tool for, even in scientific cases, when people are not doing what they should, when they're not deferring in the way that they should. Maybe you can try to set up institutions that would communicate these kinds of virtues for the purpose of getting people to defer. Now, it's an empirical question whether that will work, of course. So I'm providing a hopefully informed bet that this might be a good idea in these kinds of cases. So I'm not denying that people sometimes defer the way they should. I'm simply making a suggestion about what to do in the cases when they don't. Does that seem fair?
So this is a solution to when there's a lack of deference.
Yeah.
How to get them to be more. It's not
Right.
a general formula for increasing deference, because sometimes just being authoritarian and going, look, that's what the speed of light is. If you don't put that on the quiz, we're going to fail you. That's the way to get deference.
Yeah, well, you're providing an incentive.
Depending on the circumstances.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whether there's viewed as being a live controversy versus.
Right, exactly. No, I mean, there are certainly going to be many cases. I mean, I think in educational settings like the one you just referred to, what we're doing there is we're providing an incentive. So that would be, I mean, this goes back to some of Tyler's stuff. So incentives sometimes work. They just don't work always, and they just don't always work very well. And sometimes it's too costly of a strategy. So sometimes incentives work, for example, in educational settings. When incentives don't work or they don't work very well, this might be an alternative model for thinking about how to promote deference. So this is not a theory of deference in the sense that I'm giving an account of when people are deferring. This is supposed to be a constructive tool for promoting deference in cases where we have too little of it. Does that make sense?
Right. It's Ann, and then you, and then Guy. So, yeah.
So just real quick question. So
Yeah.
these components of fairness, are they also what you take to be the core of testimonial justice? It's, you say, sources practicing the relevant kind of justice. That's people who do this.
Yeah, exactly. Or, yeah, strictly speaking, people that are perceived in this manner, and I'm suggesting that the best way to perceive and be perceived in this manner is to be.
Okay, that's what I'd like to press then.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, it seems like the most you can get out of this is that sources appearing to practice the relevant kind of justice do this. And this is problematic partly in itself, but also I think it's especially problematic because I think sometimes you're in these terrible cases where you actually have to pick. Am I going to be fair or am I going to appear to be fair? And you can't have both. So I think a good example of this is how on the news rights, they'll say things like, well, Republicans say blah, 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 but Democrats say blah, blah, blah. And it gives people feel comfortable with that because it gives the appearance of fairness. And yet it's not the kind of fairness that just weighs the ideas. It's a kind of, it's not the right kind of fairness. And yet you might think, oh, but then I could actually get them to comply better with, my whatever if I give the appearance of fairness. So this is a worry. I wonder if you had a
Good. Yeah, no,
response to
that's, Anne, thanks so much. That's a good point. Yeah, I have some thoughts on this. So I think, well, so first, quickly, what I already said. So I think in many cases, simply the best way to be perceived as fair is to be fair. Because think about it. So if you're going to uphold the deception that's required for simply being perceived as fair without being fair, you can imagine that there are going to be cases where that is going to take more effort and resources on your part than simply being fair. So we can imagine those kind of cases. But then you say, okay, let's set those cases aside. Let's take the kind of cases where we're simply seeming to be fair. We're actually not being fair. So we have no, we can imagine educational context like this. We have no genuine interest whatsoever in finding out what our student thinks. We just want them to believe what we're telling them because we know what we're talking about. Just please listen to me. And we use this as a tool. We use perceived justice as a tool for just getting them to believe what they're supposed to believe. Now you can, so you might worry about that kind of case, but I'm wondering why. So I mean, you can certainly imagine vicious cases where you're getting people to, you're seeming to be something for the purpose of gaining something. So think of advertisement, for example. So you can certainly imagining situations where we simply want to be perceived as something objective, fair, whatever it may be, for the purpose of selling a product. Now that will be problematic. The kind of cases I'm interested in, though, is when we are seeming to be something for the purpose of actually benefiting the person that we want to perceive us in a certain way. So when I want to be perceived as just in the eyes of my student, but let's assume I have no interest whatsoever in doing anything but seeming to satisfy these considerations, there seems to be nothing cynical or vicious about that. What I'm trying to do is trying to make them better off epistemically, and in turn, by helping them become more informed on some issue where I happen to know what I'm talking about and they don't. So what I'm doing is actually benefiting them by being perceived to be in a certain manner. That doesn't seem to me to be morally problematic. Would you agree, or you would take that?
That part wasn't really my point. It was morally problematic. Just the idea of, it seems like what you would suggest, given the reason you're suggesting to be fair, is in fact And if actually being fair comes apart from the appearance of fairness,
Yeah, and it certainly
actually
can.
sometimes you should appear to be fair, and
Yeah.
fairness should go out the window.
Yes, I think that's right. And then I guess I maybe answered I answered the follow-up question then in terms of, in those kind of cases, is there something morally
Oh
problematic?
no, I just thought epistemically problematic. Of course we should.
Oh,
actually be fair.
aesthetically problematic. But
Yeah,
so
of
we're
course
shooting.
we actually should. I mean, I'm not a consequent. I'm not going to like tell a bunch of lies so that. I mean, I guess I'm more of a deontologist about epistemology than a
I
consequent-
heard
I don't
that
wanna
you
just,
are,
like-
yeah.
I don't want to just like
Yeah.
get truth any
And I
old
guess
way.
I'm a consequentialist.
Okay. Now I think I see where you will go. With
Mill
this,
was
but-
on the first slide.
No, but I think that's a different
Sorry.
issue. But yeah, okay. Well, we can follow on.
Does that
So
explain at least my position, or?
I think so. I'll have to think more about it, but
Okay.
I think so.
Okay, thanks.
That was excellent. I think you were so clear and concise, and I think this is very important, what you're talking about. And as a teacher, I genuinely want my students to see that I'm being fair with them. And have you ever heard of David Dunning at Cornell and the work he's done on? His solution, and it pertains to the consideration, I would say, as well as the third step here. But I'm leading to a question, which is, I want to challenge the second step there. Because
The consideration
sometimes
part.
considering a student's input makes it far worse. Because you say to the student, I've considered your input, and I'm giving you my fair reason, I'm showing you why, I'm still deeming your paper a C, as inferior to your classmates' papers for these specific reasons. Then they're even more angry, because now you've shown them, you've considered it, and here's why, it's still inferior, and that makes them go nuts. So what Dunning, for those of you who aren't aware of what Dunning did in the late 90s, he had Cornell students take these grammar tests and these all kinds of problem solving, and he has some how to do compared to other Cornell students, and the people in the bottom 12% still put themselves at the 60th percentile relative to other Cornell students. And so what Dunning says is we have to show students what it is they don't know so that they'll understand why they're inadequate in this instance on a given paper. And I've tried to implement that. And like sometimes it works, and sometimes the student gets absolutely enraged. So I've gone to showing the student other papers that are absolutely superb that I've read. And I'll say, see how this one is? I want you to take that home and read that. And then sometimes they come back even more angry. So what I'd like you to, and I'm really genuinely, completely trying to be fair. And like it's even based on what Dunning's work showed. So what do you say to my challenge of this step of this assumption that considering their point of view will increase the likelihood of your being seen as fair when you're genuinely trying to be fair? I actually challenge that step.
Right, so what exactly is the challenge? Is the challenge that sometimes even considering people's output is going to piss them off?
Yes, because you're considering it and you're showing them, I really understand what you're saying, and I really deem that as inadequate and as only getting a C, because in fact, it's inferior to your classmates. I have a very practical, fair reason for it. You see what I'm saying?
Do you think they would be less upset if you didn't even consider it?
This is what I'm proposing. Okay, because if they can, and what this, see, I think what the actual outcome is, if it's favorable and boosts the person's ego, it actually, there's an interaction here with what the outcome is and each of these steps, I would say, particularly step 2. If the outcome is favorable, then surely these steps are just fine. But if you deem, in all fairness, that their thinking was inadequate in their paper, this is hard.
Good, excellent.
People aren't ready to accept such things.
Right, good. So I'm going to have to take a look at Dunning's stuff.
I don't think you have to. I think that's fine. I think you could take it, Kristoffer, honestly. You've got enough, I think.
Well, actually, what you can say is, maybe they're enraged precisely because they see that it's not unfair, that they clearly got a C. I mean, that
It
is
hurts.
way more enraging than thinking that you're unfair.
You're right. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
That it hurts to hear something
So-
like undeniably you are inadequate in your paper. That's hard to hear.
So I think, so this relates to, Tyler talks about something related here. So he's considering the suggestion that people follow the law insofar as the law benefits them, all right, insofar as the outcome of the relevant legal system is to their benefit. So the alternative explanation of why people follow the law, the alternative to they consider it fair and as such legitimate, is they consider it to be such that it benefits them. Of course, that's a theory that economists like particularly. It turns out that's not a very good predictor of law-abiding behavior, you being benefited by the relevant laws. Now, that's compatible, of course, with the kind of situation that you're highlighting, namely that in some cases, this is not going to work either. So you're going to have certain, in educational sense, you're going to have certain students that even when you try to do this, it doesn't work. They still don't listen. And that's fine. The idea is that this might be a tool that would increase the likelihood of them listening, but sometimes it's going to fail. The question is whether it's going to fail more often than available alternatives. And my empirical bet is that it won't. I think, I'm not sure I got the negation right, but yeah. But yeah, you will certainly have those kind of cases. And it would be an interesting question. I do want to go back to Dunning and see if there's something to learn there about how you might be able to make this even more effective. So thanks for that.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to at the beginning and the virtue consequentialism approach and bringing out the Mill's distinction between valued and valuable. It seemed like you want to take a really strong stance, like that. If you value the virtues in a way that's not directly connected with their promotion of the end, then you're almost offering an error theory or something. Well, people can value it that way, but it's not really valuable. And so I mean, I think Mill does talk about the worry about the reign of virtue in the French Revolution, right? Condemning your neighbors for not having the virtue and the like. But I wanted to challenge that if that's not kind of a too narrow a way. John Dewey, the distinction between the valued and the valuable is a distinction that Dewey makes. The valuable, he's not just talking about the value of the virtues, but valuable about all range of values. But that for him was an open question. It remained. What was interesting about the distinction between valued and valuable is the one's decisions, but the other is an open question that can be answered in terms of the consequences it promotes, the motivations, rules, the approbations or disapprobations. How it helps to be partly constitutive, perhaps a flourishing. So did you really want to make that strong stance in terms of a non-consequentialist having kind of an error theory about it, if I got you right?
The short answer is yes. No, so, okay, so first of all, I'm not, I don't have a set view about ethical virtues. I'm not committing myself either way in the domain of the ethical. I'm interested in epistemic virtue. And actually, when it comes to epistemic virtue and the issue you highlight about needing to have some kind of error theory, I'm in a sense worse off than Mill on this point. So if you remember Mill's discussion in chapter 4 of utilitarianism, where he talks about virtues, he says that, okay, so virtues are the kinds of things that promote happiness. Now, there are these people around that value virtue in its own right, irrespective of its conduciveness to happiness. What does utilitarianism say about that? And Mill says, well, that's perfectly fine. This is perfectly compatible with utilitarianism. And there are two things going on here in the discussion that follows. One is simply the one I want to make about epistemic virtues, that you valuing something doesn't necessarily make it valuable. And that's what's going on when you value epistemic virtue in its own right. But Mill, because he is in the ethical domain and is the kind of utilitarian he is, has a further point he can add about us valuing virtues in their own right. So this is when he starts to talk about how virtue becomes part of happiness. So his idea is that So if the thing that determines the criterion of the moral is happiness, what if you start to take happiness into acting virtuously? Then virtue will become, irrespective of the consequences, then virtue will become part of your happiness. So there is an interesting interaction between epistemic virtue and, between moral virtue and happiness on Mill's view that does not exist on my view, because that you start to derive happiness from epistemic virtue has no implication for whether or not you will become more reliable and so on and so forth. So that connection is not there for me, which is why I might need some kind of error theory with respect to people valuing epistemic virtue for its own right. It's not clear that Mill does, though, because of that connection between happiness and engaging in virtuous behavior, and it becoming, as he says, part of happiness. Now, assuming that that picture makes sense, it is not one of the most clear parts of utilitarianism, but that would be the kind of claim he would want to make, whether or not it's the kind of claim that he's really allowed to make, given his philosophy. Does that answer your question?
All right, so we have time for one more, I think. Steve.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm finding your view very paradoxical the more I think about it. And I think it's related to the question Walter asked, that it seems like the paradigm case where you defer to someone is where the authority says P, and then you accept P. And what's curious about your view is that you're saying listening promotes deference, but listening, if it's to be a success word, means that somehow you move beyond P. Now it's a collaborate effort. I'm really listening to you, and if it's successful, I no longer simply stick with P. I update in light of your response. So now I believe P star, or now I believe Q. If it wasn't just sham listening, if it was actual listening. But then what I'm now at, P star or Q, which you're willing to accept because you've had this input, it seems odd to call that deference, because now it's this, P star was this collaborative kind of thing that we mutually arrived at.
I guess you have a richer notion of listening than I do, which might suggest you're a more virtuous person than I am, but no surprise there. Yeah, no, I guess I'm working with, I should have said something about this. I guess I'm working with a notion of listening that doesn't carry a robust implication for whether or not you will change your mind. So you might imagine a notion of listening that is such that if you're not sincerely in the business of being open to changing your mind, you're not engaged in the act of listening. You're doing something else. You're just directing your ears in a certain way. Now, I think there is a notion of listening between those two things. And I think, again, returning to educational contexts, I believe often I listen to my students in this way. I want to understand what they're saying, because I wanted to be able to, yes, yeah. All of my students are mistaken all the time. No, but seriously, I want to understand where they're coming from, but I don't really expect to be greatly informed by what's coming. But I want to understand what they're saying. Does this sound completely arrogant? Oh, terrible teacher. So that's the kind of listening I have in mind, and the kind of listening that scientists might do to us. When a scientist is listening to me asking questions, say a theoretical physicist, they're not listening because they think I have something important to say about theoretical physics, because I don't. But they're attending to what I'm saying, they're processing what I'm saying, and they are, on some level, understanding what I'm saying, and then they will respond. And it would seem silly, and it would seem flattering. It would be self-flattery for me to think that we're engaged in some mutual inquiry together when I'm listening to a scientist. They're doing the inquiry, I'm doing the listening, and I'm just trying to defer because they know what they're talking about. Does that seem?
Is this a follow-up? Can I follow up?
Quick follow-up.
Yeah, I think that The word input
Yes,
doesn't
that's
sound
the
like what
one.
you're talking about now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so because I understand what you're saying as
Yeah.
a teacher, but this is what it sounds like you're saying. I need to really understand where they're at
Yeah.
so that I can explain to them why they're wrong and how to kind of move them. But I do think that I'm not denigrating that because that's a real skill. I've observed sometimes, you know, things go awry this way, right? We can all see bad teaching where somebody asks a question and they're confused, but the person who's responding doesn't even understand why they're confused
Yeah.
because they can't put themselves in their perspective.
Yeah.
That is bad listening of a kind, but I don't think it's the same as what's suggested up there because you say having one's input be considered.
Yeah.
But understanding your perspective so that I can help you out of the mire of your bad you know, scientific theory or something is not really having your input considered.
Oh, really? Oh, so you
No,
feel.
I don't think so.
So you
It's
feel-
it's understanding where you're at, but input suggests, well, it suggests it has the possibility of influencing the outcome,
Yeah,
even if
yeah.
it doesn't actually.
Yeah.
But, you know, figuring out sort of where you're at so I can help you move forward
Yeah.
doesn't suggest anything about, like, actually thinking you have anything to add
Right.
to the outcome.
Right, good, thanks. Yeah, so I guess you have a
So
richer
I feel
notion
like
of
you could
input than I
change
do.
the- Oh, okay.
No, but I think that's fair.
I
So,
thought that
so,
worked- sorry, that move
He's
worked
not
a
really
lot
listening.
better for listening. Yeah, that move
Ah.
worked a lot better for listening.
I only had one card. No, so you're suggesting.
There really is that
Yeah.
other sense of listening,
Yeah.
but what's the other sense of input? Was that just a joke or?
Not really, unfortunately. No. No. So I take it your objection is that let me consider your input now. I take it your objection is that the relevant notion of input is such that it requires more of the receiver of input than simply listening, in the sense that I was outlining to Stephen. Is that correct? Yeah. I guess I don't necessarily see that. So again, imagine asymmetrical situation. So we have an asymmetry of competence. That's the kind of case I'm interested in here. If my students ask me questions on something that I know something about, I listen to what they're saying and then I respond. Now, of course, there's a possibility, and this, of course, happens sometimes, that what students ask you makes you change your mind. So there's certainly a possibility of that happening.
But then
Now, if
they're not deferring to you, if they're.
no, they never do. I know.
Oh,
No.
sorry.
So no.
I'm sorry. I should've-
No. So this is where I'm going. So I guess what I want to suggest is this. So if I listen to them sincerely, and they understand that I'm listening to them sincerely, I really want to understand what they're saying, and then I respond. It seems for them to come back and say, "You didn't even consider my input," would seem to be a mistake on their part. It seems to me that I did consider their input, and I might even have explained why their input is not reflected in my output here being my answer to their question or consideration or concern. It seems to me that it would be wrong for them to say that their input hadn't been considered, given that I listened to them. Do you think that's unfair?
Well, you know what?
None of that sounded right to me, but yeah.
I'm gonna have to ask you. Perform a socially virtuous action